Good morning, everyone. So first off, thanks to the organizers for inviting me. Because we're already in the third day, I think everyone is tired. I think I will try and start right to the heart of the matter. And to start with the question, what is exactly cord-aware? And I think it's a question that we've seen in the previous sessions as well. What is Yamnaya? What is a Bell Beaker burial? We've had it in the discussions. And I think all of us share that feeling that there is something there, but what is it exactly? I will argue that in cord-aware is an emergent property, and that in the past, cord-aware didn't exist. There wasn't any cord-aware, but what we see is a result of choices people made in the past. And that is emergent. And an emergent property means that it is only visible at a macro scale. And I want to come back to a quote that you made, Volker. I think it was on the first day, and I'm paraphrasing you. But you said that it is very easy to see Yamnaya on a macro scale. If you zoom out, you can see that there's something we can call Yamnaya. But if you start to zoom in, it becomes extremely complicated. And it's very difficult to really say this is Yamnaya or that is Yamnaya. And we have seen that throughout the sessions, discussions on whether or not these burials are Yamnaya or whatever you want to call them. Bianca also showed a couple of burials that were in between Yamnaya and local style. So we always have these definition problems. Now, I will argue that this is because this system is emergent. And it is only visible at a macro scale, and we can only study it at a macro scale. And that is the second point that I want to raise in my presentation. We need to have new tools to study this on this macro scale. We cannot study and understand cord-aware on the micro scale, on the individual burials. We need to understand it on that macro scale, on this big scale that we see it emerging. For that, I think we need network analysis, we need similarity measures to really develop new tools to study this. And thirdly, I will dive deeper into the chronology of cord-aware and also Bell Beaker. So I will slightly say a little bit about Bell Beaker as well, where we also need to adopt that thinking on the macro scale. And that has a lot of consequences of how we treat our data and how we engage with our data sets. Now, to my first point, we all know these maps. We've used them. We've created similar maps. We've debated what area should be colored in, what area shouldn't be colored in. There's, I think, 25 different versions of these maps. And we all agree that there is something we can call cord-aware, there's something we can call Yamnaya, and there is something that we can call Bell Beaker. But if we dive down into the detail and we compare different regions, different burials with one another, it becomes very complicated to say, okay, this is the boundary of cord-aware. We accept this as cord-aware and this not as cord-aware. I would argue that we need to go back to the basics to understand what it is that we are actually finding. And if we look at the 3rd millennium BC, one of the core things that we find, especially for the cord-aware, for the Bell Beaker and Yamnaya, we find burials, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of burials that are structured in a very particular way, and that showed a lot of structured information being shared across them. And I would say that these are material reflections of ideas on death that people in the past had and shared with one another. And that is exactly what we are finding each time we uncover a burial. We find the material reflections of how they treated this individual, what they gave with this individual, and the choices that were being made. And we can recognize that throughout our data set from our excavations. We find these burials and we see traits that we recognize as being cord-aware. We see traits that we think they share with one another. And all of these are individual choices that were made at a distinct point in time at a burial event where the people from the past chose to incorporate certain practices and chose to not incorporate other practices. And so we are reconstructing those choices that people made and the material reflection that we have of those choices. And this is where I would argue we see cordware emerging as a property out of people constantly renegotiating these stories on death, and based on the cultural information that they had available, but also on their choices on how to act on it. So these were choices that they were making based on the information that they had available, and choices that they deliberately acted upon or not. And sometimes we have these very strange burials that we simply cannot fit into one of these boxes. If we look at the archaeological records, we've all, of course, since a long time recognized that artifacts are at the heart of the matter. We have pottery, we have flint axes, in the case of cordware, flint axes, flint blades, and the battle axe. That's sort of the core item package that you could identify. There's maybe amber beads could be included here as well. So it's a package, but we also have graves where we have only one item. So it's a polythetic definition that Martin Vuelholt recently recoined. It's also what Mark van der Linde earlier talked about. These items are being included in the burial, but it's not a necessity to include all of these items in one grave. I would also argue that it extends way beyond simply the items that are being included in the burial. It also extends to the funerary architecture. Niels yesterday showed some of the palisaded ditches that are present in Denmark, but we have many examples actually also in the Netherlands and here, as you can see, in Poland as well, where the creation of the funerary architecture shows distinct similarities over very large distances. This is, if we excavate something like this, we have a tendency to recognize it as being cordware. So it's also about the creation of a specific burial place with a specific shape that was present in the landscape, and that sometimes may also have been covered with a burial mound. And that marking of an individual in the landscape is again part of this burial practice that we see shared across this 3rd millennium BC. We've also labeled that a steppe tradition. To what extent it is from the steppe, that's maybe up for debate. But it is a choice that people made in the past to mark out an individual in the landscape. If we zoom back in on the grave, we can see that the items, the package that's being included in it is often arrayed around the body. This is also work by Carsten Wenting, who also worked on that aspect in his dissertation, that this was probably part of a form of dress. And here you can see unfortunately, the corpse silhouette of an individual. Niels already complained about the poor preservation conditions in certain parts of the cordware realm. I sympathize with that. In the Netherlands, we have a similar problem. But one of the things you can see is that the objects are arrayed on the body. So the amber discs are placed probably soon onto clothing on this individual. Here you can see a battle axe. In many regions, it's almost always placed in front of the face, almost as if this individual is ready to use that implement. A flint axe is always placed at the back of the head, so you never see that, or rarely see that, in front of the face. So again, there's distinct choices being made. The body is arrayed and dressed in these items. And that goes for cordware, but I would say that also extends to bellbeaker to a large extent. And also, in this case, 2 flint blades are placed on the pelvis, probably worn around a belt that the individual was also, again, ready to use. So these individuals are dressed in these items, and they are dressed in a particular fashion, and we can reconstruct this particular fashion across the cordware realm. If we expand those burial practices beyond the landscape and beyond the dressing of the dead, we see that there are also distinct choices being made to orient the individuals towards cardinal directions and to create these gendered distinctions. And that is something that, again, is part of those structured burial elements that we can reconstruct in this sphere. It's also important to emphasize that those strict rules that we can see reconstruct across the cordware realm actually also apply to multiple graves. We call it the single grave burial ritual, and Martin Vuelholt has recently raised that term. But in fact, there's many multiple burials within this sphere as well. And we see that in all of those cases, those information rules still apply. in these examples, it's also highlighted how similar over large distances these graves can be. These are two multiple burials, on the left-hand side from Wetzendorf, on the right-hand side from Czernicke Gorne in Poland. The radiocarbon dates is virtually equal to one another, so they're basically from the same time period, and you see this structured placement of the individuals. Now, if you would zoom in into these graves, you would already see that in this situation, these individuals were buried in a niche burial, which is a very local tradition for Poland. And this individual, if I'm not mistaken, this individual is placed on the right side, but is in fact a female individual, which is sort of is not the norm. So again, here you see that in a local situation, people start to play with this information. But if we would zoom out, we see a broader pattern. And it's in this zooming out that I would argue this is where we see cordware. And on a local level, it's much more difficult to identify on an individual level, say, this grave is cordware, that grave is cordware. And this is where this emergence lies in. This is where we see the emergent properties of cordware at this macro level. We are seeing thousands and thousands and thousands of structured burial events that all capture some element of cultural information. We could call them the building blocks of the stories that these people in the past were trying to tell with the individuals that were buried in those graves. And what we aim to try, try to do is to reconstruct what building blocks were actually used in the creation of these stories. And are these building blocks the same across the entire cordware sphere, or even to what extent are they shared with the Bellbeaker realm? And we try to reconstruct these small bits of information at that time period. And I think that is where we will be able to distinguish what constitutes cordware, rather than an impressionist view that you can have from this level where you just say, oh, this burial is cordware, and look, this one is similar. I think we need to formally study this with hundreds and hundreds of burials to really be able to say, this is what constitutes a practice, a burial practice that is shared across this cordware realm. The problem is, for that, we need different tools. We need tools to study this at the macro level. And that is what I applied for a grant a couple of years ago at the Dutch Science Foundation, and was granted in 2022. And we started to try to reconstruct the transmission of cultural information across Europe in this time frame, 3500 to 2000 BC, using a bottom-up approach where we focus on burial practices. Now, initially, the goal is that we will create a database of 10,000 cordware and Bellbeaker burials. When I had to defend this against the committee, they called me a megalomaniac, which may be true, but we're going for it anyway. And we now have already 5,000 cordware and Bellbeaker burials from the area that we are working in. And we are at the same time developing new tools to study this transmission of cultural information. Now, I already highlighted in the introduction that I think we need to develop new tools. And some of those new tools are network analysis. And this is, by the way, research that we've been developing at Leiden University already for the past couple of years. And this is research by my PhD student, Louise Olerud, who's there in the, back in the room. And she could actually already show that gender in this time period is articulated very differently dependent on what region you are in. So in Denmark, there's the more classical right flex versus left flex definition, but in southern Germany, actually it's all over the place. And you can illustrate that by properties of the network, by showing how the network is arranged against the other network. This is, by the way, something that is a poster outside, so feel free to pester Louise after during the coffee break with questions, because I think this is the future of the research. Now, in recent years, this was published last year in a book that was edited by Christian and by Guus. Erik Kroon and I, we already explored these large macro-scale properties by using similarity measures. We compared 1,000 burials with each other and expressed how different or how similar each burial is to all of the other ones. And we created what is called a similarity matrix, and where you could just say grave number 1 in Denmark is very similar to grave number 2 in Denmark, but also very similar to grave number 500 in the Czech Republic. But it's completely dissimilar to grave 225 in Poland. Now, those similarity measures give us an indication of the degree of information sharing across the quarter-aware realm. And if we explore that information sharing across the entire data set, which is the blue line, we can see that virtually 80% of the total similarity across all burials in our data set, so more than 1,000 burials, occurs within 200 kilometers of one another. So that means it's a very local, regional information sharing that we see. So the majority of the burials are similar to burials within 200 kilometers of one another. That's sort of the regional range that we are operating in. What we were actually also able to show, if you look at left-flexed individual, that degree of similarity over distance is up to 90%, which means that the left-flexed individuals in quarter-aware, which are predominantly biologically sexed as female, is a very regional tradition. So the information, the similarity between burials over that distance is very regionally defined within a range of roughly 200 kilometers. If you take the right-flexed individual, which is the red line, actually there's a difference here. You see that there's more than 50% of the similarity, or close to 50%, actually extends beyond 200 kilometers. And that means that all the right-flexed individuals, which are often biologically sexed as male, though not exclusively, share a lot of cultural information across the entirety of the quarter-aware realm. So male burials look very much like all of the other male burials across the entirety of quarter-aware, compared to left-flexed individuals, female individuals, which are much more regionally defined. These are regional styles. And we can explore that simply based on the degree of similarity between individual burials. We can visualize that as well using network analysis. These are left-flexed individuals. You can see here a network representation where each dot is a burial, a left-flexed burial in this situation, and the colors relate to specific regions, and the lines between two nodes indicate the strength of the similarity, the degree of similarity in burial practices shared with each burial. So if the line is red between these two burials, that indicates they share virtually the entire burial practice. And so it's basically the same burial, just a different region. And what this shows is, in fact, if we go back to this one, that the majority of the similarity is within the local region. And so a lot of burials within Bohemia are very similar to one another, or with the neighboring region. So Saxony-Anhalt is just the neighbors next door. And there's a lot of similarity that extends to that. But if you look at the Danish burials, they actually fall outside of that. So they have different burial practices that show up in the archaeological record that do not show up in central Germany or in Bohemia. In the inverse, if you look at right-flexed individuals, note that here, the Danish burials are extremely well connected to Saxony-Anhalt, showing that they have a high degree of similarity of cultural information extending over much larger distances compared to the left-flexed individuals. And there's also a high degree of information sharing between the Netherlands, between Schleswig-Holstein, Saxony-Anhalt, and Bohemia. But note also that here, the burials from Moravia actually stand out from this graph. They don't share a lot of similarity with the other graves. And so this is probably an indication that there's something in the sharing of information that doesn't cross a boundary here with Moravia. Whatever that may be, we can then explore that further. But this is a tool to really explore the sharing of cultural information. As I said, at Leiden, we are really developing this network analysis as a tool, and we are also extending that beyond burials, but we also try to use that in pottery. And this is research by my soon-to-be ex-PhD. He's defending the 18th of September, Erik Kroon. He tried to plot the recipes with how you make a cordware pot. And so we all know there's the chaîne opératoire, the ways to make a pot. There's a very distinct way of operating. There's steps you have to take. You have to model the clay, then you have to coil it, and at some point you have to fire it. All of those steps you can represent as a network. Those are steps you need to take to make, ultimately, a pot. What you can do is you can take hundreds of pots, in the top TRB pots, at the bottom cordware pots, and then compare the steps that people took. Essentially what you're seeing here is a cooking recipe for a TRB pot at the top and a cooking recipe for a cordware pot at the bottom. Now what this allows us to do is to explore the degrees of difference between cordware pots and TRB pots. And we can explore that using statistics that are being developed by network scientists, where we can explore how different is a cordware pot from pots that are being found in megaliths. And in fact, Eric was able to show that they are, frankly, not that different from TRB pottery. Essentially, a TRB potter or a cordware potter would be able to make each other's pottery. It's only a superficial shine that looks slightly different from one another. And also what note here that the cordware pots are very similar in distance to the megalith inventories compared to TRB late flat graves. So here we see that at the same time when people were burying individuals in TRB flat graves, these are roughly contemporaneous by the way, potters were making cordware pots and they were basically using very similar recipes. There are slight differences. We do see that there are introductions in cordware pottery that we do not see in TRB pottery, and that probably relates to technological information that is being brought from outside elsewhere. And what we are now developing, this is by the way proof of concept, this I think we made it Tuesday, where we try to explore the patterns that make up cordware. So we try to explore what is it that makes cordware and how significant are the patterns that we see in relation to all the other burials within the data set. And that is what you can see here on the left. The numbers represent a certain position within the grave. Is it in front of the face, at the back of the head, towards the feet? And we can see that there are certain objects that are always placed in a specific position against the body or in relation to the body. And that is significant over the entire data set. So those patterns are what make up cordware. This is what we see when we study cordware at an emergent level. We are now able, and again, as I said, this is Tuesday, this proof of concept, so please don't read too much in these graphs. It will probably change in the future, but I think this is how we should explore the cordware realm and the burial practices and sharing of burial practices across the cordware space. If you look at all of these artifacts and you split them up between right-flexed and left-flexed in the Czech Republic, you can see that there's similarities across individuals on where certain artifacts are to be placed, in particular pottery in relation to the body, but also that there are certain artifacts that are, of course, the items that like a battle axe, are often showing up in right-flexed individuals, which isn't that surprising, but it shows that the method works, that we can identify these patterns. And we can also explore regional differences. In pink, we have German cordware right-flexed burials, and in blue, we have Danish right-flexed burials. And here we can see that there are regional differences that start to emerge if we explore this, with the absence of vessels, amphora, and also to a certain extent beakers in Danish cordware burials compared to German right-flexed burials where pottery is much more prevalent. But then we also see similarities. Here we see a high degree of overlap between items and where they are supposed to be placed in the burial pit. Now again, don't read too much into these graphs, but it's to show that I think that this is the way forward to explore how cultural information was shared across this space. Now, the third aspect that I want to talk about is chronology, and again, to apply this to this concept that we can only see cord wear on a macro level. And we need to be aware of that we must use tools to study radiocarbon dates at that macro level. And I think that is something that we saw a lot of radiocarbon dates the past couple of days, and I think we need to use different tools. The tools have already been developed by the Oxford lab, but we need to use them to study these phenomena at its macro scale. One of the other elements that we did, and I keep saying we, but basically I'm not the one who's collecting the data, it's the PhDs and the student assistants, so it's really their merit. We collected 964 radiocarbon dated burial events, and where we were certain about the association between the radiocarbon date and the cultural information that we reconstruct. So we were certain that this is indeed, I think none of us would disagree that that burial would be a cord-wear burial. That burial would be a bell beaker burial. In total, we collected, I'm going to say this from the top of my head, but I think 550 bell beaker radiocarbon dates and 450 cord-wear burial dated events. We applied strict chronometric hygiene. So is the association correct? Are we certain that the sample that is being dated dates the burial event? And that is something that we all know in the grey literature. If you explore that, you find the radiocarbon dates. And then it's supposed to date the burial, but it actually comes from a ditch and it's a small piece of charcoal. So that is a poor association. So we went very critically through all of the dated events. And we studied those using what has been called optimal linear estimations to study the emergence and extinction of cord-wear and bell beaker in certain regions, and also using kernel density estimates to explore the trends within the radiocarbon dates. A couple of words on OLE, optimal linear estimation. So the principle comes from biology, where they want to understand the extinction events of certain species, that at what point in time do they go extinct. And colleagues at my department have actually used it to model the arrival and extinction of Neanderthals in southern France. So they adopted the technology, collaborating with the people who created this method, and it essentially works on the distribution of your population. So if you have a certain observations of the presence of your population, which in our case are radiocarbon dates. And so if we have a radiocarbon date of a cord-wear burial, we can be fairly certain that at that point in time, cord-wear was present. You can use the distribution between each individual point to calculate from your last observation and then the distribution of the previous observations when the likely estimated end or emergence, we can flip the mathematics around, when the end or emergence of this observation would happen. If all of the observations are very close to one another in time, then the OLE will give a very short range, because these are all of the last observations, they're very close to one another. So you're very certain that these are, or the likelihood that these are observations that are close to one another, and this is very close to the end, that is modeled in this way. But if there's a large distance between your radiocarbon dates, it probably means that you have very ephemeral population that you pick once every century, and then at some point it might go extinct or it might emerge. So you have a much longer tail in your OLE calculation. And so in this way, you use the information of your population to calculate the emergence and the extinction of a certain event, rather than going for just the last date and then saying, hey, this is the last moment when we saw that. Because one of the problems that we have with radiocarbon dating, if you take enough radiocarbon dates, at some point, if you have 100 radiocarbon dates, you actually have 4 or 5 radiocarbon dates that are 3 standard deviations older or younger than what you expect. And we tend to work with 2 standard deviations. So if you radiocarbon date a single date and you plot it, there's a likelihood that the radiocarbon date that dates really at the extent of the phenomenon you're researching should actually be younger, or the probability that it is younger is greater. I think that's the right formulation here. And so there's a greater probability that this radiocarbon date, if you take all of these observations into account, should be slightly younger. And you can model that for all of these radiocarbon dates and create these kernel density estimates. There's other methods. You could use some probability distributions, but kernel density estimates are actually better suited to study extinction and emergence events. They're less influenced by the calibration curve. And this allows us to explore to what extent there is a probability that a certain radiocarbon date will fall within a certain range. So there's a higher probability in central Germany that around 2500, if you find a Cordeware burial, the probability that it will date in this range is much greater than it will date in this range. And both of these pieces of information we've now used to create a detailed chronology of Cordeware and Bellbeaker to explore at what points in time does Cordeware and Bellbeaker emerge and at what times does it go extinct. Now, again, this is, we have prepared a manuscript for this. We are very close to submitting it. But some of the results I can already show here. If you explore the oldest, the emergence of Cordeware at the top and Bellbeaker at the bottom, you can already see some of the patterns that we start to see in our data set. First off, in Cordeware, we see multiple potential origin sources, where we can see that at multiple points in Bohemia, in central Germany, but also in the Baltics, virtually at the same time we see the emergence of Cordeware, and then there's a very rapid expansion within just a couple of centuries of Cordeware towards the west, the south, but at a later stage towards the east. And so the eastern expansion of Cordeware appears to be later. If we would look at Bellbeaker, we see the oldest radiocarbon dates centering around the Pyrenees. This is the location where we have the oldest radiocarbon dates. And then fairly quickly, and also note the temporal distance between the first expansion of Cordeware and the first arrival of the first sightings of Bellbeaker burials around the Pyrenees is very close in time to one another, within, let's say, a century of one another. But then very quickly, we see Bellbeaker already popping up in Bohemia. We see Bellbeaker popping up in different regions in France. Notably, along the Rhine, there's a couple of very early burials of Bellbeaker as well. One of the things that we did, and I'm actually also curious about feedback on that, so we explored the arrival of the cultural information of Cordeware and Bellbeaker, and we tested that against the arrival of steppe ancestry as it was modeled in the recent paper by Allentoft and the Copenhagen colleagues to see if they match up. If there's the same pattern we see in the spread of steppe ancestry and the same pattern we see in the spread of cultural information. And one of the things that we see, if we compare those methods, if we compare those data sets, we actually can see that there is certain areas where it does seem to match up. So the green line, sorry, I should explain this. The green line is what the cultural information shows. The red line is what the steppe ancestry shows in the Allentoft 2024 paper. And this is Fernando Racimo's paper from 2020, where they calculated the arrival of steppe ancestry based on the model that they had. One of the things we can see is that there's a notable time lag between the arrival of steppe ancestry versus the arrival of the cultural information. And this is also brought out by the fact that we see very early here the Cordeware burial ritual, but quite late in the East. And we can compare that for the entire map. So we did some statistics to compare our results with the results from the genetic model, and there's no correlation between these two. The spread of steppe ancestry does not correlate to, or the spread of steppe ancestry as modeled in this paper does not correspond to what we see with the radiocarbon dates. Now, this, of course, was already discussed previously in the Olalde paper, where the arrival of steppe ancestry does not always correspond to the arrival of Bellbeaker burials. But the map that I just showed, this map, doesn't really look at the population level. So that's one thing we still need to explore. To what extent does this pattern correspond to the overall distribution of Cordeware dates that we can reconstruct in a given region. For that, we created a ridgeline plot of quarter-ware kernel density estimates of distinct regions. So here we see the Eastern Baltics, Bohemian Basin, etc. And in green, we have the emergent state, so the OLE calculation of the earliest potential arrival, the probability that the earliest quarter-ware burial should be located at, is in green, and the latest potential sighting of quarter-ware in red. So the extinction of quarter-ware. One of the things that we can observe is what we call a fast polyfocal spread. So if we look at quarter-ware, it spreads very rapidly within a couple of generations of one another across large parts of Western Europe. The earliest radiocarbon dates we would model in the Bohemian Basin, in the Eastern Baltics. Those are the oldest that we have, but very quickly afterwards we have in the central German uplands, the Main-Danube region, northwest and northeast European plain. That's already around, let's say, 2850 BC. The second expansion of quarter-ware towards the east only occurs around 2700 BC, at least according to the way that we modeled it. And you can see that with the emergence dates for many of these regions only occur after or around 2700, 2750 BC. So there's a time lag between the spread of quarter-ware towards the east, and we see it emerging earlier in the west. But what this also shows is that the main body of quarter-ware radiocarbon dates emerges around 2600, 2400 BC. That virtually the majority of radiocarbon dates that we have fall within that narrow window of 2 centuries. And that's just a probability that if you find a radiocarbon date and if you find a quarter-ware burial, you radiocarbon date it, you will very likely hit this group of dates. That indicates that across Europe, around 2500, 2600 BC, there must be some change that all of a sudden we see quarter-ware. We see quarter-ware spreading everywhere, and in the period before that, quarter-ware was already present, but not very dominant at that time yet. So if we look at or at least the probability that we have quarter-ware in these regions are very low, and probably indicates also something about the structure and the nature of quarter-ware society at that time. If we look at the final point here, the extinction of quarter-ware and also the kernel density estimates of quarter-ware clearly indicates a persistence of quarter-ware in many regions across Europe until roughly 2000 BC. There are certain regions where quarter-ware does seem to end fairly abruptly, and I'll explore some of those later, but there is still a persistence of quarter-ware burial traditions way until 2000 BC. And then from 2000 BC, it seems to abruptly end. Now, I promised to also say something about Bell Beaker. If we explore the same patterns within the Bell Beaker kernel density estimates and the OLE estimates, we can see that Bell Beaker arrives in the Pyrenees around 2700, 2800, 2900 BC. There's still a lot of uncertainty here because we don't have that many dates. Therefore, also the OLE estimate is much broader. So the estimate is about 3 centuries in terms of the emergence. But nevertheless, it must fall somewhere in the first half of the 3rd millennium BC, and probably even well before 2700 BC. Then, secondly, we see the first Bell Beaker burials arriving in the Seine-Loire river basins, also on the western Iberian Peninsula, the Upper Rhine and Main-Danube area. That's also where we see a lot of the early Bell Beaker burials arriving as well. And then thirdly, we see a broader extent around 2500 BC. By the way, I forgot to mention, one of the interesting things that we observe with these early Bell Beaker individuals, the early Bell Beaker burial rituals, is that these are individuals where we already see the semi-flexed position. We see the artifacts that are associated with the burials being typical Bell Beaker, but we do not yet necessarily see the gendered opposition. That gendered opposition does only seem to appear around the Upper Rhine and Main-Danube region, which I think aligns quite well with what Volker said earlier. Yeah, sorry. One of the other aspects that we see as well is that the broader extent of cordware, so the full emergence of cordware, only sees, bell-beaker. The full emergence of bell-beaker only happens around 2500, 2400 BC. That's when we see it in Britain. That's when we see it in parts of Eastern Europe as well. And so that is sort of more the classical picture that we would expect from the spread of bell-beaker. Again, we see the main body of radiocarbon dates around 2400, 2200 BC. So that is, again, a time period where all of a sudden we see a shift, potentially in the society as well, where many people start to bury in a bell-beaker fashion compared to a cordware fashion before that. And finally, again, we see an end of the bell-beaker burial ritual around 2000 BC. It should be noted that in certain regions, people have also argued for a persistence of bell-beaker, but it changes into a different burial ritual. In the Netherlands, we call it barbed wire burials. In the UK, they have food vessels, or in other regions, they have different names like proto-agnotites or something like that. That is something that happens in this time period. We also think that the end of both cordware and bell-beaker seems to coincide, and it's probably related to a more fundamental change on a European scale, probably related to the introduction of tin bronze, where trade networks changed fundamentally around that time, and probably with that change into tin bronze, we would also see a change in ideology within the societies. But that's a different matter. Finally, and this is the last slide that I want to show on this chronology, I also want to highlight if we look at the kernel density estimates for cordware and bell-beaker and look at the intersection of these kernel density estimates, we see that there's a long persistence or a high probability of coexistence of bell-beaker communities with cordware communities. And that might extend to multiple centuries, even half a millennium in some cases in the central German uplands, where these people were basically living next door to one another. And there's also archaeological evidence to back that up. We have actually multiple graves where we have both cordware and bell-beaker pottery in the same burial pit. That has always been placed at somewhere the transition period, but it's probably part of a longer, broader coexistence of bell-beaker and cordware. Note, by the way, that the Dutch model still holds for the Netherlands. This is the Dutch model from the 1970s, where cordware is succeeded by bell-beaker. That still seems to hold true, but it doesn't hold true for large other parts of Europe. Yeah, so those are the slides that I wanted to emphasize. I'm happy to discuss the chronology aspects and also the methodological aspects that I will introduce earlier. But I think the key point here is that emergent properties that constitutes cordware is something that should only be analyzed at this higher level. We cannot analyze cordware, we cannot analyze Yamnaya or bell-beaker at the individual site level because it is not present there. It's only something that we see at the emergent level, at the macro scale level, and therefore we need these tools to study this exchange of information at that level. Thank you.